So I want us to shift our attention very quickly to trespass to persons. And trespass to the person consists of three main torts. It consists of assault, it consists of battery, and it also consists of false imprisonment. But it also relates to Wilkinson versus Downton tort, and it also relates to harassment. Now, there are key features when it comes to trespass to person. Number one, it must involve a direct act, and it is also actionable per se. In other words, there is no need to prove damage. And another key feature is that it protects personal integrity and liberty. Now, there are two types of interference. We have direct interference and we have indirect interference. Now, a direct act is simply an act which directly affects the other person. And a good example is throwing a stick at someone. That actually amounts to trespass. Now, when it comes to an indirect act, it is simply an act which affects the other person, but not in such a direct way. And a good example is you throw a stick onto the road and somebody later trips over the stick. And this usually amounts to negligence. Now, we have the case of Litang versus Cooper. And the facts of this particular case were that the claimant sunbathed in a car park, and the defendant accidentally drove over her legs. And she sued after the limitation period for negligence expired and claimed trespass instead. And the issue was, can an intentional injury amount to trespass to the person? And the rule is that trespass requires intentional direct force, so that negligent acts fall under negligence and they are not trespass. So the application of this particular case is that the defendant's act was negligent but was not intentional. And the conclusion of this particular case was that the claim failed because action lay in negligence, not trespass. Now, I want us to look at the first element when it comes to trespass to the person, and that is assault. Now, what is assault? Assault is an act causing another person to apprehend immediate unlawful force. And no physical conduct is usually required when it comes to assault. And a good example of assault is when you raise a fist threateningly to somebody. When you raise a fist threateningly to somebody, that amounts to assault. Now, assault has various elements. The claimant must prove a number of things for assault to be established. The claimant must prove, number one, that there was an act by the defendant, and number two, there was reasonable fear or apprehension, and number three, there was immediate unlawful force. If you look at the case of Stephen versus Myers, the fact of this particular case was that the defendant advanced towards the claimant with clenched fist, but was stopped before reaching him. And the issue was, can assault occur without physical contact? And the rule is that assault occurs if claimant reasonably fears immediate violence. And the application of this case was that the claimant reasonably believed he would be struck. So the conclusion of this case was that assault was established. We also have the case of Thomas versus National Union of Mine Workers. And the facts of this particular case was that striking miners shouted threats at workers inside buses while police prevented access. And the issue in this particular case was whether there was fear of immediate violence. And the rule is that assault requires apprehension of immediate harm. And the application of this particular case was that the workers were protected by police and buses. The conclusion of this case was that there was no assault. Now, there is also the idea of words as assault. Now, originally, words alone could not amount to assault. But in this age and time, words can actually amount to assault. And we have the case of R versus Ireland. And the facts of this particular case was that the defendant made repeated silent phone calls causing fear. And the issue was, can silence or words amount to assault? And the rule is that words or silence causing fear of immediate violence can be assault. And the application of this case was that silent calls created psychological fear. And the conclusion of this particular case was that assault was actually established. We also have another case of Taberville versus Savage. And the facts of this particular case was that the defendant placed, his hand on his sword, but said judges were present, so he would not attack. So the issue was, did gesture amount to assault? And the rule is that words can negate threatening conduct. And the application of this case was that statement showed no immediate intention to attack. The conclusion of this case was that there was no assault. No assault occurred. Now, I want us to shift our attention from assault and look at another element that concerns trespass to person, and it is called battery. Now, what is battery? Battery is direct and intentional application of unlawful force to another person. And a good example is punching, another good example is throwing water, and also snatching a handbag from somebody else. Now, there is a force requirement when it comes to battery, so that even minimal contact qualifies as battery. If you look at the case of Cole versus Turner, the facts of this particular case were that the courts considered whether minor touching could amount to battery. And the issue is, does slight touching qualify as battery? And the rule is that the least touching in anger is battery. And the application of this case was that even minor unwanted contact qualifies. The conclusion of this case was that battery was actually established. There is also the intention requirement when it comes to battery, so that only intention to apply force is required and not intention to cause injury. So here we have the case of Wilson versus Springle. And the facts of this particular case was that a schoolboy pulled another's bag, causing injury. And the issue was horseplay battery. And the rule is that touching must be hostile or outside everyday conduct. And the application was that the court held that touching in this particular case was not sufficiently hostile. So the conclusion was there was no battery. But later this was doubted by courts, as was in the case of Collins versus Wilcock, where the facts of this particular case were that a police officer grabbed a suspect arm without lawful authority. And the issue was this acceptable everyday contact? And the rule was that touching outside ordinary social contact without justification amounts to battery. And the application of this particular case was that the officer exceeded lawful authority. The conclusion of this case was that battery was actually committed. We also have the case of in Re F, which involves, mental patient and sterilization. And the facts of this particular case was that it simply concerned, medical treatment without valid consent. And the issue was, must touching be hostile to be battery? And the rule is that any unlawful touching may be battery, even if it is not hostile. So the application of this case was the court doubted, the hostility requirement in this case. Now, we also have the idea of transferred intent when it comes to battery. So intent applies even if a wrong victim is harmed. And here we have the case of Livingston versus Ministry of Defense. And the facts of this particular case were that a soldier fired a rubber bullet at a rioter but hit the claimant. And so the issue was, does intent transfer? And the rule is that transferred intent applies to battery. And the application of this case was that force was intended, though the wrong target was struck. And the conclusion of this case was that battery was actually established. Now, there is a difference between assault and battery. You see, assault is simply the fear of harm. But battery, in most cases, is actual physical contact. And a good example, if you hit somebody from behind, that amounts to battery alone. Now, there is the third element when it comes to trespass to person called false imprisonment. Now, what is false imprisonment? You see, false imprisonment is total restraint of a person's freedom of movement without lawful justification. Now, there are certain requirements as far as false imprisonment is concerned, and the claimant must prove two things. The claimant must prove, number one, there was restraint, and number two, the restraint was total, or the restraint was absolute. So I want us to look at the first requirement, which is the restraint requirement. Now here there is no need to prove physical force. And a good example is if you are locked in a room, or there is threat preventing movement, or there is authority preventing exit. Now, there is also the second requirement of total restraint. Now, there must be no reasonable escape route. Restraint must be total. Restraint must be absolute. If you look at the case of Bird versus Jones, the facts of this particular case were that the claimant was prevented from walking along fenced part of a bridge, but could return using a different route. So the issue was restraint total? And the rule is that false imprisonment requires total restraint. And the application of this particular case was that there was an alternative route available. And the conclusion of the case was that there was no forced imprisonment because an alternative route was available. Now, there is also the idea of knowledge of restraint when it comes to forced imprisonment. Now, originally, knowledge was required, but nowadays, knowledge is unnecessary. If you look at the case of Meering versus Graham White Aviation Company Limited, the facts of this particular case were that the claimant was questioned in a room and was unaware that guards prevented exit. And so the issue was, must the claimant know about restraint? And the rule is that awareness is not necessary. And the application of this particular case is that the freedom is restricted regardless of knowledge. And the conclusion of the case was that forced imprisonment was actually established. We also have the case of Murray versus Ministry of Defense. And the facts of this particular case were that the claimant was detained by Army during the Northern Ireland operations. And the issue was, is knowledge required? And the rule is that awareness is not essential for forced imprisonment. And the application of this particular case is that there was detention without lawful justification. So the conclusion of the case was that forced imprisonment was actually established. Now, there is an interesting case that contrasts what we've just discussed, and it is the case of Herring versus Boyle. Now, the facts of this case was that a schoolboy was kept at school without knowing the reason. And the issue was awareness required? And the rule is that in the earlier rule, it required knowledge. But the application of this case was that the claimant was unaware. So the conclusion was that there was no forced imprisonment. But remember, this is now an outdated kind of position in law. Now, there are various defenses when it comes to trespass to person. And the first defense is consent. Now, consent is a valid defense to assault, to battery, and also to forced imprisonment. And examples is where you have medical treatment or where you have participation in sports. And here we have the case of Hard versus Weardell Steel Coal and Coke Company Limited. And the first of this particular case was that a miner refused dangerous work and demanded lift to surface, but was kept underground for 20 minutes. And the issue was he falsely imprisoned? And the rule is that consent within contractual limits defeats claim. And so the application of the case was that the miner consented to remain underground during the shift. And so the conclusion of the case was that there was no false imprisonment. We also have the second defense when it comes to trespass to person called self-defense. Now, the defendant may use reasonable force only when it comes to self-defense. If you look at the case of Len versus Holloway, the facts of this particular case was that an older man insulted the defendant and lightly struck him. Now, the defendant punched him, causing very serious injury. And the issue was force reasonable? And the rule is that force must be proportionate. And the application of this particular case was that the response was excessive. And so the conclusion was self-defense failed as a defense. We also have the third, defense when it comes to trespass to person called lawful arrest. Now, police may lawfully commit assault, they may lawfully commit battery, they may lawfully commit forced imprisonment. That is, if the arrest is lawful. And an example in stature is where you have the Police and the Criminal Evidence Act of 1984. So that is all I have as far as, trespass to person and defenses are concerned. But when it comes to your exam, I want you to remember a few things that we have pointed out. I want you to remember that assault requires act, it requires fear, and it requires immediate harm. And battery requires direct contact, it requires intentional force, and it requires no lawful justification. But forced imprisonment requires total restraint and no lawful justification. I also want you to remember the defenses. Remember consent, remember self-defense, and remember lawful arrest. So that is all I have as far as trespass to person is concerned. If it is your first time here, make sure to follow this channel and to subscribe for more legal lessons.